Being No One, The Self-Model Theory of Subjectivity by Thomas Metzinger. 2.2. From Mental to Phenomenal Representation, Information Processing, Intentional Content, and Conscious Experience. Mental representation is a process by which some biosystems generate an internal depiction of parts of reality. Footnote. Quote, representation and quote, depiction are used here in a loose and non-technical sense and do not refer to the generation of symbolic or propositionally structured representations. As will become clear in the following sections, internal structures generated by the process of phenomenal representations differ from descriptions with the help of internal sentence analogs by the fact that they do not aim at truth, but at similarity and viability. Viability is functional adequacy. End footnote. The states generated in the course of this process are internal representations, because their content is only, if at all, accessible in a very special way to the respective system, by means of a process which today we call, quote, phenomenal experience, end quote. Possibly this process itself is another representational process, a higher order process, which only operates on internal properties of the system. However, it is important for us, right from the beginning, to clearly separate three levels of conceptual analysis. Internality can be described as a phenomenal, a functional, or as a physical property of certain system states. Particularly from a phenomenological perspective, internality is a highly salient, global feature of the contents of conscious self-awareness. These contents are continuously accompanied by the phenomenal quality of internality in a pre-reflexive, quote-unquote, manner that is permanently and independently of all cognitive operations. Phenomenal self-consciousness generates, quote, unquote, inwardness. In chapters 5 and 6, we take a very careful look at this special phenomenal property. On the functional level of description, one discovers a second kind of, quote-unquote, inwardness. The content of mental representations is the content of internal states, because the causal properties making it available for conscious experience are only realized by a single person and by physical properties which are mostly internally exemplified, realized within the body of this person. This observation leads us to the third possible level of analysis. Mental representations are individual states, which are internal system states in a simple physical spatial sense. On this most trivial reading, we look only at the carriers or vehicles of representational content themselves. However, even this first conceptual interpretation of the internality of the mental as a physical type of internality is more than problematic, and for many good reasons. Obviously, it is the case that frequently the representations of this first order are in their content determined by certain facts, which are external facts, lying outside the system in a very simple and straightforward sense. If your current mental book representation really has the content of book in a strong sense, depends on whether there really is a book in your hands right now. Is it a representation or a misrepresentation? This is the classic problem of the intentionality of the mental. Mental states seem to be always directed at an object. They are states about something because they have intentionally, quote unquote, contain an object within themselves. Treating intentional systems as information processing systems, we can today develop a much clearer understanding of Brentano's mysterious and never defined notion of intentional inexistence by, as empirical psychologists, speaking of, quote, virtual object emulators, end quote, and the like. See chapter 3. The most fundamental level on which mental states can be individuated, however, is not their intentional content or the causal role that they play in generating internal and external behavior. It is constituted by their phenomenal content, by the way in which they are experienced from an inward perspective. In our context, phenomenal content is what stays the same irrespective of whether something is a representation or a misrepresentation. Of course, our views about what truly is, quote unquote, most fundamental in grasping the true nature of mental states may soon undergo a dramatic change. However, the first person approach certainly was historically fundamental. Long before human beings constructed theories about intentional content or the causal role of mental representations, a folk psychological taxonomy of the mental was already in existence. Folk psychology naively, successfully, and consequently operates from the first person perspective. A mental state simply is what I subjectively experience as a mental state. Only later did it become apparent that not all mental Object-directed states are also conscious states of actual phenomenal experience. Only later did it become apparent how theoretical approaches to the mental, still intuitively rooted in folk psychology, have generated very little growth of knowledge in the last 25 centuries. That is one of the reasons why today, those properties which the mental representation of a part of reality has to possess in order to become a phenomenally experienced representation are the focus of philosophical debates. What sense of internality is it that truly allows us to differentiate between mental and phenomenal representations? Is it phenomenal, functional, or physical internality? At the outset, we are faced with the following situation. Representations of parts of the world are traditionally described as mental states if they possess a further functional property. This functional property is a dispositional property, as possible contents of consciousness. They can, in principle, be turned into subjective experiences. The contents of our subjective experience in this way are the results of an unknown representational achievement. It is brought about by our brains in interaction with the environment. If we are successful in developing a more precise analysis of this representational achievement and the functional properties underlying it, then this analysis will supply us with defining characteristics for the concept of consciousness. However, the generation of mental states itself is only a special case of biological information processing. The large majority of cases in which properties of the world are represented by generating specific internal states, in principle, take place without any instantiation of phenomenal qualities or subjective awareness. Many of those complicated processes of internal information processing, which, for instance, are necessary for regulating our heart rate or the activity of our immune system, seldom reach the level of explicit conscious representation. Footnote. I treat an explicit representation as one in which changes in the representandum invariably lead to a change on the content level of the respective medium. Implicit representation will only change functional properties of the medium, for instance, by changing synaptic weights and moving a connectionist system to another position in weight space. Conscious content will generally be explicit content in that it is globally available and in perception directly covaries with its object. This does not, of course, mean that it has to be linguistic or conceptually explicit content. Next footnote. Not all relevant processes of biological information processing in individual organisms are processes of neural information processing. The immune system is an excellent example of a functional mechanism that constitutes a self-world border within the system, while itself only possessing a highly distributed localization. Hence, there may exist physical correlates of conscious experience, even of self-consciousness, that are not neural correlates in a narrow sense. There's a whole range of only weakly localized informational systems in human beings, like neurotransmitters or certain hormones. Obviously, the properties of such weakly localized functional modules can strongly determine the content of certain classes of mental states, for example, of emotions. This is one reason why neural nets may still be biologically rather unrealistic theoretical models. It is also conceivable that those who fully determine the actual content of conscious experience will eventually have to be specified not on a cellular, but on a molecular level of description for neural correlates of consciousness. End footnote. Such purely biological processes of an elementary, self-regulatory kind certainly carry information, but this information is not mental information. They bring about and then stabilize a large number of internal system states, which can never become contents of subjective, phenomenal consciousness. These processes, as well, generate relationships of similarity, isomorphisms. They track and covary with certain states of affairs in the body, and thereby create representations of facts, at least in a certain weak sense of object directedness. These states are states which carry information about subpersonal properties of the system. Their informational content is used by the system to achieve its own survival. It is important to note how such processes are only internal representations in a purely physical sense. They're not mental representations in the sense just mentioned, because they cannot, in principle, become the content of phenomenal states, the objects of conscious experience. They lack those functional properties which make them inner states in a phenomenological sense. Obviously, there are a number of unusual situations, for instance, in hypnotic states, during somnambulism, or in absence automatisms, in which functionally active and very complex representations of the environment, plus of an agent in the environment, are activated without phenomenal consciousness or memories being generated at the same time. We return to such cases in Chapter 7. Such states have a rich informational content, but they are not yet tied to the perspective of conscious experiencing self. The first question in relation to the phenomenon of mental representation, therefore, is what makes an internal representation a mental representation? What transforms it into a process which can, at least in principle, possess a kind of quote unquote inwardness? The obvious fact that biological nervous systems are able to generate representations of the world and its causal matrix by forming internal states, which then function as internal representations of this causal matrix, is something that I will not discuss further in this book. Our problem is not intentional, but phenomenal content. Intentionality does exist, and there is now a whole range of promising approaches to naturalizing intentional representational content. Conscious intentional content is the deeper problem. Could it be possible to analyze phenomenal representation as a convolved, a nested and complex variant of intentional representation? Many philosophers today pursue a strategy of intentionalizing phenomenal consciousness. For them, phenomenal content is a higher order form of representational content, which is intricately interwoven with itself. Many of the representational processes underlying conscious experience seem to be isomorphy preserving processes. They systematically covary with properties of the world, and they actively conserve this covariance. The covariance generated in this way is embedded into a causal teleological context because it possesses a long biological history and is used by individual systems in achieving certain goals. The intentional content of the states generated in this way then plays a central role in explaining external behavior as well as the persistent internal reconfiguration of the system. However, the astonishing fact that such internal representations of parts of the world can, besides their intentional content, also turn into the experiences of systems is described as persons. The astonishing fact that such internal representations of parts of the world can, besides their intentional content, also turn into the experiences of systems described as persons, directs our attention to one of the central constraints of any theory of subjectivity, namely addressing the incompatibility of personal and subpersonal levels of description. Footnote. It is one of the many achievements of Daniel Dennett to have so clearly highlighted this point in his analyses. The fact that we have to predicate differing logical subjects, persons and subpersonal entities like brains or brain states, is one of the major problems dominating the modern discussion of the mind-body problem. It has been introduced into the debate under the heading Nomological Incommensurability of the Mental by authors like Donald Davidson and Jae-Gwon Kim, and has led to numerous attempts to develop a non-reductive version of materialism. End footnote. This further aspect simultaneously confronts us with a new variant of the mind-body problem. It seems to be in principle impossible to describe causal links between events on personal and subpersonal levels of analysis, and then proceed to describe these links in an ever more fine-grained manner. This new variant, in turn, leads to considerable complications for any naturalist analysis of conscious experience. It emerges through the fact that, from the third-person perspective, we are describing the subjective character of mental states under the aspect of information processing carried out by subpersonal modules. What is the relationship of complex information processing events, for example in human brains, to simultaneously evolving phenomenal episodes, which are then, by the systems themselves, described as their own subjective experiences when using external codes of representation? How was it possible for this sense of personal level ownership to appear? How can we adequately conceive of representational states in the brain as being, at the same time, object-directed and subject-related? How can there be subpersonal and personal states at the same time? The explosive growth of knowledge in the neuro and cognitive sciences has made it very obvious that the occurrence as well as the content of phenomenal episodes is, in a very strong way, determined by properties of the information flow in the human brain. Cognitive neuropsychology, in particular, has demonstrated that there is not only a strong correlation, but also a strong bottom-up dependence between the neural and informational properties of the brain and the structure and specific contents of conscious experience. This is one of the reasons why it is promising to not only analyze mental states in general with the help of conceptual tools developed on a level of description that looks at objects with psychological properties as information processing systems, but also at the additional bundle of problematic properties possessed by such states that are frequently alluded to by key philosophical concepts like experience, perspectivalness, and phenomenal content. The central category on this theoretical level today is no doubt formed by the concept of representation. In our time, representation has, through its semantic coupling with the concept of information, been transposed to the domain of mathematical precision and subsequently achieved empirical anchorage. This development has made it an interesting tool for naturalistic analyses of cognitive phenomena in general, but more and more for the investigation of phenomenal states as well. In artificial intelligence research, in cognitive science, and in many neuroscientific subdisciplines, the concept of representation today plays a central role in theory formation. One must not, however, overlook the fact that this development has led to a semantic inflation of the term, which is more than problematic. Footnote. Useful conceptual clarifications and references with regard to different theories of mental representation can be found in S.E. Palmer, 1978. See also Cummins, 1989, Stitch, 1992, von Eckert, 1993. Also, we must not ignore the fact of information, the very concept which has made this development toward bridging the gap between the natural sciences and the humanities possible in the first place, by being by far the younger category of both. Footnote. The first safely documented occurrence of the concept in the Western history of ideas can be found in Cicero, who uses representatio predominantly in his letters and speeches and less in his philosophical writings. A Greek prototype of the Latin concept of representatio, which could be clearly denoted, does not exist. However, it seems as if all current semantic elements of representation already appear in its Latin version. For the Romans, representare, in a very literal sense, meant to bring something back into the present that had previously been absent. In the early Middle Ages, the concept predominantly referred to concrete objects and actions. The semantic element of taking the place of has already been documented in the legal text stemming from the 4th century. For an excellent description of the long and detailed history of the concept of representation, see Shearer, 1990, Schultz, 1991, and also Metzinger, 1993. Representation is a traditional topos of Occidental philosophy, and a look at the many centuries over which this concept evolved can prevent many reinventions of the wheel and theoretical cul-de-sacs. At the end of the 20th century in particular, the concept of representation migrated out of philosophy and came to be used in a number of frequently very young disciplines. In itself, this is a positive development. However, it has also caused the semantic inflation just mentioned. In order to escape the vagueness and the lack of precision that can be found in many aspects of the current debate, we have to first take a look at the logical structure of the representational relation itself. This is important if we are to arrive at a consistent working concept of the epistemic and phenomenal processes in which we are interested. The primary goal of the following considerations consists in generating a clear and maximally simple set of conceptual instruments, with the help of which subjective experience, that is, the dynamics of exclusively phenomenal representational processes, can step by step and with increasing precision be described as a special case of mental representation. After this has been achieved, I offer some ideas about how the concrete structures to which our conceptual instruments refer could look. The concept of mental representation can be analyzed as a three-place relationship between representanda and representata with regard to an individual system. Representation is a process which achieves the internal depiction of a representatum by generating an internal state which functions as a representatum. The representatum is the object of representation. The representatum is the concrete internal state carrying information related to this object. Representation is the process by which the system as a whole generates this state. Because of the representatum, the vehicle of representation being a physical part of the respective system, this system continuously changes itself in the course of the process of internal representation. It generates new physical properties within itself in order to track or grasp properties of the world, attempting to contain these properties in Brentano's original sense. Of course, this is already the place where we have to apply a first caveat. If we presuppose an externalist theory of meaning and the first insights of dynamicist cognitive science, then the physical representatum, the actual vehicle of representation, does not necessarily have its boundaries at our skin. For instance, perceptual representational processes can then be conceived of as highly complex dynamical interactions within a sensory motor loop activated by the system and sustained for a certain time. In other words, we are systems which generate the intentional content of their overall representational state by pulsating into their causal interaction space by, as it were, transgressing their physical boundaries, and in doing so, extracting information from the environment. We could conceptually analyze this situation as the activation of a new system state functioning as a representatum by being a functionally internal event, because it rests on a transient change in the functional properties of the system, but which has to utilize resources that are physically external for their concrete realization. The direction in which this process is being optimized points toward a functional optimization of behavioral patterns, and not necessarily toward the perfectioning of a structure-preserving kind of representation. From a theoretical third-person perspective, however, we can best understand the success of this process by describing it as a representational process that was optimized under an evolutionary development and by making a background assumption of realism. Let's now look at the first simple conceptual instrument in our toolkit, box 2.1. Let me now offer two explanatory comments and a number of remarks clarifying the defining characteristics with regard to this first concept. The first comment, because conceptually, phenomenality is a very problematic property of the results of internal information processing, which, however, will have to be at the heart of any natural theory of subjective experience, it is very important to first of all clearly separate processes and results on the analytical level. The reason we have to do this is to prevent certain equivocations and phenomenological fallacies. As a matter of fact, large portions of the current discussion suffer from the fact that a clear distinction between representation and representatum is often not made. A representatum is a theoretical fiction, a time slice of an ongoing representational process viewed under the aspect of its content. What does this mean? As long as we choose to operate on the representational level of description, it is not the basic neural process as such that is mental or that becomes the content of consciousness. It is a specific subset of likely more abstract properties of specific internal activation states, neurally realized data structures, which are generated by this process. The phenomenal content, the experiential character of these activation states, is generated by a certain subset of the functional and computational properties of the underlying physiological dynamics. Phenomenology supervenes on internally realized functional properties. If you now look at the book in your hands, you're not aware of the highly complex neural process in your visual cortex, but the content of a phenomenal mental model. For the concept of a phenomenal mental model, see section 3.3 in chapter 3, which is first of all generated by this process within you. If, at the same time, you introspectively observe the mental states evoked in you by reading this, maybe boredom, emotional resistance, or sudden interest, then the contents of your consciousness are mental representata and not the neural process of construction itself. There's a content vehicle distinction. In short, if we talk about the contents of subjective experience, we do not talk about the underlying process under a neuroscientific description. What we talk about are phenomenal content properties, abstract features of concrete states in the head. At least under a classic conception of representation, there's a difference between vehicle properties and content properties. A second aspect is important. In doing this, we almost always forget about or abstract from the temporal dynamics of this process and treat individual time slices as objects, particularly if their content properties show some invariance over time. I call this the, quote, error of phenomenological reification, unquote. There exists a corresponding and notorious grammatical mistake inherent to folk psychology, which, as a logical error, possesses a long philosophical tradition. In analytic philosophy of mind, it is known as the phenomenological fallacy. Footnote. Cf. An early formulation by Place, 1956, section 5. Quote, this logical mistake, which I shall refer to as the phenomenological fallacy, is the mistake of supposing that when the subject describes his experience, when he describes how things look, sound, smell, taste, or feel to him, he's describing the literal properties of objects and events on a peculiar sort of internal cinema or television screen, usually referred to in the modern psychological literature as the phenomenal field. And footnote. However, one has to differentiate between two levels on which this unnoticed transition from a mental process to an individual, from innocent sequence of events to an individual mental object can take place. The first level of representation is constituted by linguistic reference to phenomenal states. The second level of representation is constituted by phenomenal experience itself. The second can occur without the first, and this fact has frequently been overlooked. My thesis is that there is an intimate connection between those two levels of representation, and that philosophy of mind should not confine itself to an investigation of the first level of representation alone. Why? The grammatical mistake inherent to the descriptions of folk psychology is ultimately rooted in the functional architecture of our nervous system. The logical structure of linguistic reference to mental states is intimately connected with the deep representational structure of our phenomenal space. What do I mean by saying this? Phenomenality is a property of a certain class of mental representata. Among other features, this class of representata is characterized by the fact that it is being activated within a certain time window. This time window always is larger than that of the underlying neuronal processes, which, for instance, leads to the activation of a coherent phenomenal object. For example, the perceived book in your hands. In this elementary process of object formation, as many empirical data show, a large portion of the fundamental processuality on the physical level is being, as it were, swallowed up by the system. In other words, what you subjectively experience as an integrated object possessing a trans-temporal identity, for example, the book you're holding in your hand, is being constituted by an ongoing process which constitutes a stable, coherent content, and in doing so, systematically deletes its own temporality. The illusion of substantiality arises only from the first-person perspective. It is the persistent activity of an object emulator, which leads to the phenomenal experience of a robust object. More about this later. For further details and references, see Metzinger 1995, Singer 2000. It is important to note how, on a second level, the way we refer to phenomenal contents in public language once again deletes the underlying dynamics of information processing. If we speak of a content of consciousness, or a content of a single phenomenal representation, we reify the experiential content of a continuous representational process. In this way, the process becomes an object. We automatically generate a phenomenal individual and are in danger of repeating the classic phenomenological fallacy. This fallacy consists in the unjustified use of an existential quantifier within a psychological operator. If I look into a red flash, close my eyes, and then experience a green afterimage, this does not mean that a non-physical object possessing the property of greenness has emerged. If one talks like this, one very soon will not be able to understand what the relationship between phenomenal individuals and physical individuals could have been in the first place. The only thing we can legitimately say is that we are currently in a state which, under normal conditions, is being triggered by the visual presence of objects, which in such standard situations we describe as green. As a matter of fact, such descriptions do not refer to a phenomenal individual, but only to an introspectively accessible time slice of the actual process of representation. That is, to a content property of this process at t. The physical carrier of this content marked out by a temporal indicator is what I will henceforth refer to as the representative. So much for my second preliminary comment. Let us now proceed by clarifying the concept of mental representation, and let us first turn to those relata which fix the intentional content of mental representations, those facts in the world which function as representanda in our ternary relation. Representanda are the objects of representation. Representanda can be external facts like the presence of a natural enemy, a source of food, or a sexual partner, but also symbols, arguments, or theories about the subjectivity of mental states. Internal facts, like our current blood sugar level, the shape of our hormonal landscape, or the existence of infectious microorganisms, can also turn into representanda by modulating the activity of the central nervous system and in this way changing its internal information flow. Properties or relations, too, can be objects of the representational process and serve as starting points for higher cognitive operations. Such relations, for instance, could be the distance toward a certain goal state, which is also internally represented. We can also mentally represent classes, for instance, of prototypical sets of behavior producing pleasure or pain. Footnote. The theoretical framework of connectionism offers mathematically precise criteria for the similarity and identity of the content of internal representations within a network. If one assumes that such systems, for example, real-world neural nets, generate internal representations as activation vectors, which can be described as states within an n-dimensional vector space, then one can analyze the similarity of the distance between two representata as the angle between two activation vectors. For a philosophical naturalization of epistemology, this fact can hardly be underestimated as to its importance. About connectionist identity criteria for content, see also P.M. Churchland, 1998, unpublished manuscript, Laxo and Cottrell, 1998. And footnote. Of particular importance in the context of phenomenal experience is the fact that the system as a whole, with all its internal, public, and relational properties, can also become a representanda. See Chapter 6. Representanda, therefore, can be external as well as internal parts of the world, and global properties of the system play a special role in the present theoretical context. The system S itself obviously forms the first and most invariant relatum in our three-place representational relationship. By specifying S as an individual information processing system, I want to exclude more specific applications of the concept of a representational system, for instance, to ant colonies, Chinese nations, scientific communities, or intelligent stellar clouds. Again, if nothing else is explicitly stated, individual members of Homo sapiens always form the target class of systems. The representandum, Y, is being formed by an actual state of the world. At this point, a particularly difficult problem arises. What precisely is actuality? Once again, we discover that one always has to presuppose a certain temporal frame of reference in order to be able to speak of a representation in real time at all. Without specifying this temporal framework, expressions like representation of the system's environment in real time or actual state of the world are contentless expressions. Let me explain. Conscious angels, just like ant colonies or intelligent stellar clouds, do not belong to our intended class of explanatory targets, but for a different reason, because they possess only mental, but no physical properties. For physical individuals, absolute instantaneousness unfortunately presents an impossibility. Of course, all physically realized processes of information conduction and processing take time. For this reason, the information available in the nervous system in a certain very radical sense never is actual information. The simple fact alone that the trans and conduction velocities of different sensory modules differ leads to the necessity of the system defining element, ordering thresholds and windows of simultaneity for itself. Within such windows of simultaneity, it can, for instance, integrate visual and haptic information into a multimodal object representation, an object that we can consciously see and feel at the same time. Footnote. For the importance of an ordering threshold and a window of simultaneity in the generation of phenomenal time experience, see, for example, Popple, 1978, 1988, 1994. See also Rudnow, 1995. This simple insight is the first one that possesses a genuinely philosophical flavor. The sameness and the temporality in an expression like at the same time already refer to a phenomenal now, to the way in which things appear to us. The nowness of the book in your hands is itself an internally constructed kind of representational content. It is not actually simpliciter, but actuality. It's not actuality simpliciter, but actuality as represented. Many empirical data show that our consciously experienced present, in a specific and unambiguous sense, is a remembered present. I return to this point at length in section 3.2.2. The phenomenal now, to be continued.